Hello everyone, this is the fourth video in my series of reviews of the Famicom Wars franchise, also known as Advance Wars and Game Boy Wars. Well, it took long enough, but we're finally here. I'm going to talk about the first Advance Wars game. Back in the hands of its original developers, Famicom Wars crosses the ocean and reaches the West, and it's a good thing they waited until now, because Advance Wars 1 is the most polished and playable in the series up to this point. It's loaded with wonderful features and content, and its success may or may not have led to Fire Emblem's localization as well. In addition to the Smash Brothers games anyways. This game is very back to basics in the sense that there aren't any massive twists to the basic gameplay like railroads or bulldozers or White Moon instead of Blue Moon. Instead, the mechanics were greatly streamlined and the unit count reduced to 18 to keep things nice, simple, and accessible. The transporter unit and the supply truck were merged into the armored personnel carrier. Direct combat units now attack first on their turn, always instead of simultaneous fire, and unit matchups were rebalanced. The only huge problem is, what else? The Navy. The prices are still far too high, but whatever. A tutorial mode is also included to get new players into the game easier, though it does have a rather high number of missions. This is actually an annoying tutorial mode because you're forced to keep animations on and the speed at its slowest. Fortunately, the only tutorial mission you have to play is the Fog of War stage. Speaking of which, Fog of War also changed to allow units to become stealth while in a forest. That is, you don't see them at all unless you move next to the forest. This also happens for Navy units and reefs. It's a nice addition to Fog of War. I don't particularly like this style of game, because I think it's luck-based somewhat in multiplayer and a game of memorization in single player, but it's good that they try to shake things up. Now on to the biggest addition. The concept of commanding officers that Super Famicom Wars introduced has been seriously expanded upon, with 11 different playable characters that grant bonuses and penalties to particular units they command. Muscle Mad Max has the best direct combat units but poor indirect range. Solid Sammy commands speedy foot soldiers and transports but lesser direct combat units. And Handyman Andy is average at everything. It's not just the stat bonuses though. Every officer has an additional ability called a CO power. It is usable after taking or dealing enough damage, similar to a limit break or a super in a fighting game. What's really creative is that many of the CO powers are more than a straight power boost, they all do something unique as well. Andy's CO power repairs your units, Drake's power damages all enemy units, Grit can expand the range of his indirects, and Eagle lets all your units strike twice in the same turn. Annoying bogey. These characters form the basis for the plot of the new campaign mode, which takes the player through up to 22 of the 34 available missions. Gameplay in campaign mode is very streamlined compared to previous games. The maps in the campaign all start with units already deployed on both sides for the most part, meaning you don't have to spend time building your army up and then moving it across the map at a snail's pace. You get straight to the action instead. Of course, most maps also don't let you get any additional units, forcing you to work with what you've got. The mission objectives this time can vary, from the classic route or capture HQ, to securing a portion of the buildings on the map to just plain surviving long enough. Depending on actions taken during the game, you'll unlock extra missions and find branching paths to take. Though, I'll be totally honest, considering the difficulty of the optional levels, they tend to feel more like a punishment. That's right, this game is hard. For the most part, it's the well-designed kind of difficulty, too. For much of the game, you'll select from 3 officers of Orange Star, no longer Red Star because communism, Andy, Max, and Sammy. Your opponents are officers from the other countries, and you face them all under conditions that greatly benefit them and not you. Yes, it's completely unfair, and you'll hate every last one of them by the end, but I think that adds to the satisfaction you get upon finally figuring out a strategy to beat them. Of course, all things considered, the strategy is usually just to pick Max and run over all the enemies. He is absurdly stronger than the other two, so you'll probably use him the entire game. Yeah, this game isn't exactly the greatest when it comes to balance. Your completion of each stage is given a ranking based on 3 factors: the number of turns taken to complete it, the highest number of enemies destroyed in a single turn, and the number of units you lost. It can sound like a strange ranking system unless you know how it works, in which case it's easy to work with. It's a shame the game doesn't go into detail when it elaborates how the ranking system works. For example, the number of turns you need to beat the map in for maximum speed is never told to the player. Ranking systems are good to have though, since it separates players who just rush to complete the stage the fastest with players who conduct their play more skillfully. Regardless of balance issues, campaign mode is still a great test of your tactical skill, and even better, completing the game unlocks an even harder version of the main campaign. Unfortunately, this advanced campaign is both the craziest challenge and the biggest joke. Most maps are just the same as they were in the normal campaign, just with some extra units. Nothing that seriously alters your strategy. Then there are the maps that were totally harmless last time that are now horrible, horrific abominations. The mission Canbay's Error is the most infamous of them all, as a simple stage becomes a bomber-infested nightmare. I swear, the only way you could beat this is to find a specific turn-by-turn setup, or look up a guide, or get lucky. Kind of a bit of an uneven hard mode. The plot of the game is not a whole lot to speak about, just enough of an excuse to get the player to fight the other countries and eventually a big baddie, which is standard for a Nintendo game, although I do think there's potential here for revealing interesting backstory based on what path a player takes through the game. Your first opponents are Olaf and Grit of Blue Moon, and both of these characters originate from Orange Star, for example. Olaf seems to be acting under someone else's orders, and we also find that Yellow Comet and Green Earth are hostile to Orange Star because apparently Andy attacked them. This is revealed to be, I kid you not, a clone of Andy created by Sturm of the Black Hole Army to eliminate his enemies by getting them to kill each other. One wonders how he managed to make a 100% accurate clone of Orange Star's newest officer, though I imagine painting all of his tanks red would have been enough to fool the other countries into thinking it's them. I mean, come on. This is Andy we're talking about. No way could he ever mount an assault on another country. That's Max's job. There's a second single-player mode as well, the War Room. This mode is a throwback of sorts to previous games. No War Room map contains pre-deployed units, just bases to build from and an enemy CO. The computer is still an advantage in most maps though, and this is where the AI's less than stellar skill shows itself. The computer is just not good at this game. It can be exploited in numerous ways, including simply rushing to the enemy HQ with transports and infantry, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's talk level design. I like War Room as it makes for a nice foil to Campaign. In Campaign, you only had 3 COs to work with, so the game could be designed around those COs and none other. War Room lets you select any CO you've unlocked, and the way the COs are, each one of them can complete every map in a different manner. You'll probably still just run over everyone with Max, but at least if you pick someone else, the way you play will certainly change along with the CO, if you see what I mean. It's totally possible to get a perfect score on any combination of map and CO too. There's an issue with the level design though. You probably know this by now, but about half the maps are either taken from or inspired by Super Famicom Wars. Those maps were big, and they're really big here too. They're so massive, in fact, that it could take ages to clear them normally. Just look at Dire Range or Terra Maw, it's nuts. Thing is, the AI is still pretty bad, so just rushing a transport to the HQ usually gets things done in far less time. In fact, considering some of the times they want you to get, the developers might just want you to do that in the first place. It's kind of a shame to design such a large map and then not even use giant chunks of it. Come on, guys! Still, you could argue that running circles around a broken AI and discovering the quickest road to a perfect score in as little time as possible is a fun activity in its own right, and I totally agree. There are only 20 maps in War Room mode, however. This means that there are 88 single-player challenges altogether, counting both campaigns. There are a lot more multiplayer maps to play, but the thing about multiplayer maps in Advance Wars is that the devs don't exactly have a clear grip on what makes a great multiplayer map. Fortunately, the map editor is back, although it's less cool than Hudson's map editors. You can't change the size of the map from its original 30 by 20, and that's a bit difficult to work with if you use air units and want a smaller map. You also cannot send maps outside of the link cable, which is also used for link battles. That doesn't stop the map editor from adding a wealth of replay value though. When I started playing, I remember there being dozens of sites like Advance Wars Net and Wars World News where people would share maps and discuss the games, creating their own challenges and multiplayer stages. The multiplayer scene grew larger with the advent of Advance Wars by Web, a web-based clone of the game. The scene isn't quite as big considering the hype has waned a lot, but to this day I'm still stunned nobody at Nintendo capitalized on the growing fan base. Well, actually, I can kind of guess. Advance Wars was way popular when it came out in the US and Europe, but it never hit it big in Japan. This is because, for whatever reason, Advance Wars frequently gets delays in its home country. People say that the first Advance Wars was delayed in Japan because it came out in America on September 10th, 2001, just one day before the September 11 attacks. But would that have delayed it outside of America? I mean, it's just strange. It came out in US first. Well, whether that was the reason for the delay, Advance Wars didn't come out in Japan for a full 3 years, when it was released in a combo pack with its own sequel. And even then, the Nintendo DS was coming, and Advance Wars DS was right behind it. Clearly a big mistake was made somewhere, and the game never got the foothold I think it could have. Anyhow, at the end of the day, Advance Wars remains one of the big must-haves for the strategy games fans who own a GBA. The game can also be played on Nintendo's Virtual Console today, and it's recommended to give at least one of these games a try. Up next in this video series, we have the sequel, Advance Wars 2, a decent, refined follow-up if lacking just a bit in refreshing content.